The University of Nevada, Las Vegas wishes to acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities of this region and recognize that the university is situated on the traditional homelands of the Nuwuvi Southern Paiute people. We offer gratitude for the land itself, for those who have been stewarding it for generations, and for the opportunity to study, learn, work, and be in community with this land. We encourage everyone in the UNLV community to engage in continued learning about the indigenous peoples who work and live on this land since time immemorial, including the Las Vegas Paiute tribe and the Mawapa Band of Paiutes, and about the historical and present realities of colonialism. As one of the most diverse universities in the United States, UNLV believes it is important to recognize and appreciate the use of Southern Paiute land as part of its mission to be a welcoming and inclusive place for working and learning.
Thanks for joining us, everyone, for another episode of the award-winning We Need to Talk series on systemic racism. We're going to start with the land acknowledgement. The University of Nevada, Las Vegas wishes to acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities of this region and recognize that the university is situated on the traditional homelands of the Nuwu Southern Paiute people. We offer gratitude for the land itself, for those who have stewarded it for generations, and for the opportunity to study, learn, work, and be in community with this land. We encourage everyone in this space to engage in continued learning about the indigenous peoples who work and live on this land since time immemorial, including the Las Vegas Paiute tribe and the Mawapa Band of Paiutes. As one of the most diverse universities for undergraduate students in the United States, UNLV believes it is important to recognize and appreciate the use of Southern Paiute land as part of its mission to be a welcoming and inclusive place for working and learning. All right. So this afternoon, the program is sponsored by the UNLV Libraries and the Greenspun College of Urban Affairs. We're streaming live today thanks to our friends at UNLV TV. So for those of you who come to this often, you know something is amiss here. I'm standing in for Ms. Clay T. White, and I'm Brittani Sterling, the Social Sciences and Interdisciplinary Gender and Ethnic Studies librarian and an assistant professor who is very, very passionate about this topic. I study the effects of workplace treatment at the intersection of identities of BIPOC librarians and how their lived experience affect their decisions to stay or leave work environments. Often we situate these discussions on DEI only about students, but there's many layers to the conversation, so that's why I'm hosting today. Though we come to this from a student perspective, employee retention and career longevity in institutions of higher education are critically important issues as well. So I'd like to introduce today's panelists. Joining us are Atar Haseebullah, Executive Director of ACLU Nevada, Imani Patterson, Senior Assistant Director of Student Diversity Programs, Quentin Savoy, President of the NAACP Las Vegas chapter, and of course, the esteemed Clay T. White, Director of the UNLV Oral Histories Research Center. At the end, we'll have a chance for the audience to ask questions of our panelists, and if you're watching remotely, you can email questions to university.libraries@unlv.edu. I'll be switching between paper and phone, y'all, so bear with me here. Whoops. And hopefully I won't drop anything. Okay. So I am a person who believes that knowing definitions of things is really, really important because we talk to each other saying the same words and don't always know what they mean. So hopefully it is not reductive to anyone to go over the definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're also just gonna look really briefly at what equal employment opportunity and affirmative action mean, because sometimes people put all of it under DEI umbrella and they're related things, but they're not exactly the same. So for the purpose of today's conversation, diversity is ensuring all identifiers across race, gender identities, sexual orientations, religions, political beliefs, socioeconomic statuses, and other characteristics are recognized. Equity is the fair treatment of all previously stated identifiers, making sure every person in a shared environment has the same opportunities, resources, and support. Inclusion is making sure a space is comfortable for every type of person present, and everybody should be feeling valued and respected, or at least that's what some of us think. Equal employment opportunity is fair treatment in employment, promotion, training, and other personnel actions without regard to race, color, religion, sex, age, national origin, and physical or mental disability. And then lastly, affirmative action is a set of policies and practices that aim to help marginalized groups. The goal is to address inequalities in pay and employment, increase access to education, promote diversity, social equity and inclusion, and correct historical wrongs. So now that we're all on the same page, I'm gonna tell you what proponents of DEI think, a collective version. So proponents of DEI believe it's important to create diverse, inclusive environments and help underrepresented or oppressed groups move towards equity, i.e. gaining proportionate status and power in society relative to overrepresented groups. Many also believe that creating more inclusive environments will foster creativity and combat interpersonal prejudice by creating more cohesive, empathetic, and dynamic environments. The challengers of DEI believe that DEI initiatives place a focus on identity signifiers instead of merit, achievement, or ability. By focusing on inclusion within specific groups rather than individuals, they think this work increases divisions by setting groups against each other. So if you had not heard that argument, now you have. Alrighty, so the origins of DEI in the workplace is where we're gonna start because, like I said, we often think about the students, but someone's gotta make this place run, right? So we're gonna talk about that first. They can be traced back to the mid-60s when social movements and legal changes began to reshape the corporate world. And because of a little known thing, the Civil Rights Act, anybody heard of that? It was passed 60 years ago this year, actually. And so it outlawed discrimination in the US based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. We tend to think about arguments or discussions around the Civil Rights Act to talk about ending segregation in public places, desegregated schools, strengthening voting rights enforcement, but we don't always think about prohibited discrimination in hiring, promoting, and firing. So, Atar, we often hear about marching, the sit-ins, the activism, but the aftermath of integration right after this landmark legislation is often eclipsed. Can you explain to us exactly what was mandated in workplaces with the passing of the Civil Rights Act, and how did it change the American work world forever?
Sure. I can project or use the mic.
You got a mic.
Oh, does this? I wasn't sure if it was a dual or solo. I'm still getting used to it as well. So for those that don't know me, my name's Atar Haseebullah. I'm the executive director of the ACLU of Nevada. By background, I'm a civil rights attorney, but I have a long history. I was a government attorney for many years. I've worked in-house for different organizations, and I've been deeply engaged in what we call justice lawyering, being a justice lawyer for many years, which means that we focus on issues to help people and to advance justice across the board. The ACLU is the nation's largest civil liberties and civil rights organization. And when I say civil liberties, I mean individual liberties that are afforded to you by the Constitution and by statute. And I never say civil liberties without saying civil rights, because civil rights means the equal application of those rights to all people, including people like me who otherwise wouldn't have access to being able to do the work I do. Our team, we have about 15 people statewide. It's not just lawyers. We have policy professionals. We have organizers that work deeply to move the community. And we combine all those efforts to advance all civil liberties and civil rights issues for all Nevadans, regardless of their background, in order to make our state a better place. So going to your question specifically, it's one that deeply resonates with me and my work, because the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there's many civil rights acts that have been passed, but the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is the one we most commonly refer to because it was so sweeping. And within that specific act, which came as a result, not necessarily just of a couple years prior, but because of the legacy of Jim Crow, because of barriers to opportunity, because of what happened in the American South, Midwest, and in the West, including places like right here in Nevada, where segregation and or discrimination were prevalent forces. That Civil Rights Act did a couple things. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is best known for really two features: creating Title VII protections, which allow for ensuring that the government, but also private employers, do not discriminate based on a host of different factors, and also for the creation of the EEOC. Many people have obviously come to know about the EEOC. When you have an employment discrimination claim, it's oftentimes your first stop. But that piece of legislation was sweeping for a number of reasons, namely that that's kind of the first time it was called out at that level, creating a federal standard that blocked discrimination based on these factors. We had periods of time during the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment when we started undergoing a Reconstruction post-Civil War, and then almost immediately thereafterwards, you have Jim Crow enacted, you have black codes that are enacted, you have barriers to workplace entry, you have discrimination that subtly occurs, and there may have been a shift from overt actions into sort of subversive actions that are still hitting the same points. So that was the precursor to what we often have now in state laws as well, which create duplicative standards for non-discrimination clauses, where you're able to enforce those at the state level and not just at the federal level. But absent that federal standard, we really wouldn't have had anything in place to be able to preclude against those efforts. And that does not mean that it was sweeping, holistic, and the best piece of legislation that was out or ever been put out. But for its time, it may have been the most progressive piece of legislation to combat discrimination efforts in workplace settings that had existed up until that point.
Thank you. So, actually quitting the ACLU, a lot of challengers of DEI like to proclaim that DEI programs universally promote undeserving people who only advance because they check a box. And so, at this point, I would like to ask Ms. Clayton White, champion of the West Side, how she came to be in her current position as the director of UNLV's Oral History Center.
So she switched questions on me. So I decided to go back to school later in life to get a master's degree. And when I entered the program here at UNLV to get a master's in American history, the powers that be decided that it was time for us to learn to conduct oral histories. We had one oral history program in the state of Nevada, and it was at UNR. And we didn't have, the legislature never funded it well enough for the history to be collected all over the state. It was just in that Reno, Sparks area. So people in the history department decided that we were going to start learning oral history here at UNLV. That's what we did. They brought in people to teach us from San Diego and from Reno. And once we thought we knew everything, we conducted an oral history project. Everybody who volunteered to learn oral history at that time, about 1995, were all females. Everybody in the history department, staff, professors, students, could have taken all of the workshops and classes free of charge. But it was only women who were going back to school later in life who decided that we wanted to learn oral history. So everybody decided on an area. Once we learned, then we decided we're going to conduct an oral history project. And it's going to be about women in gaming and entertainment. So someone said, I want to interview dancers and showgirls. And someone else said, I want owners and managers who were women over the years. And other people selected other things. And I said, I don't want to do the transcribing. I want to do something actually conducting oral histories. So they said, you know, there's a Black community here. And I said, where is it? Because we had no idea. And no one in the room had any idea. But I was going to a Black beautician at the time, went to see her, and I said, where's the Black community? She said, the woman getting into the chair next is the woman you have to meet. And it was Jimmy Gay's daughter. And Jimmy Gay was my first person that I interviewed, Jimmy and Hazel Gay. Not really part of the women in gaming, but That was my first interview. So that's how we got started working in the West Side community. Jimmy Gay was the first person who came here to be a Black mortician. 1947, but he was not allowed to take the exam. So it didn't stop him. He decided that he was going to find other kinds of employment. So he was the first Black to have a professional position at the Sands and worked his way then to all kinds of things in the community, outside of the community, with the NAACP. He chaired the Freedom Fund banquet every year. Las Vegas sent more money at that time, the late 40s, early 50s, to the national NAACP than any other city in the country, because Jimmy Gay knew how to lobby with all of the other casinos that the Sand interacted with. So that's what we did for the NAACP early on. So now what was the rest of the question? That's how it got started.
That actually lets me segue into another question for you, Clay T, which is, what did you tell me that you found out a little bit later, your oral history last year?
So I am an opportunity hire, meaning that at one point, if you were going to hire someone and the job, it's not a job that you actually advertised for, but you had this person in mind for a job. And opportunity hires did not have to go through the same process of getting hired to an institution of higher education as other people did. So I was called, at that time I was in Ahoskie, North Carolina. Peter Michelle, who ran special collections and lead library at the time, along with the dean, Dr. Marks, decided to call me to see if I wanted the job as being the director of the first Oral History Center. And that's how I got it. So I came out here to apply for a job when I was a guest at a wedding. On a weekend, I came out. They interviewed me that weekend. I got the job, flew back to North Carolina.
Wow. Hell of a wedding.
Thank God it wasn't mine.
So I actually asked Clay T to tell that story because I don't think a lot of people would have guessed that is how she came to be in her current position. And I don't think it's deniable the effect that she's had on the city of Las Vegas, Southern Nevada, and the Las Vegas Valley. And that's important to keep in mind when thinking about DEI in higher education and thinking about the employment issues as well. So as I mentioned in the opening, I actually research BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color librarians, in their faculty status and the things that they go through. And a lot of times in the research that I have found, people are, even if they can get into positions, they are fighting things like gatekeeping, white supremacy culture characteristics, people not thinking they deserve to be there, even though they spent the same money to get their degrees and did the same work. And so I really wanted Clay T to mention that because even when we are all, I guess, evenly credentialed, there are still barriers in the employment space. So, Quentin, on to you next. So we can't discuss the fight for DEI in education, especially higher education, without discussing systemic inequality. The NAACP does advocacy work around protecting and expanding the teaching of Black history, as well as the increase of financial aid in higher education. What do those issues have to do with the larger umbrella of DEI, and how do they acknowledge systemic inequalities on behalf of all Nevadans?
All of the questions were so beefy. I love it.
I'm an academic, y'all. I'm sorry.
I love it. I said, yeah, I'm speaking at a university. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Quentin Savoy. Tremendous question, Brittany. Thank you for asking. The NAACP was founded in 1909, specifically to be a vanguard to protect civil rights. Across discrimination, instances of like political violence, aggressive political violence, and just general racial inspired violence against Black folks all over this country. Your question about education, advocating for Black history, and history just in general, I think gets to the space that the association has been in creating opportunities for all of us, right? Being founded by 22 members, most of which were not Black people, honestly. Most of the founders in 1909 were not Black, but were abolitionists. But were dedicated to making sure that there were opportunities abound for folks as we were realizing the promise of America. The association's position has consistently been access and history. When the Supreme Court decision came down last year, our campaign continues to be diversity no matter what, understanding that the rich tapestry of our country has been to our benefit collectively. And when extremists try to roll those things back, that's just what America's been doing for decades at this point, trying to erase what the true history of this country has been, who's been at the vanguard of helping to realize those promises. And I think the attacks on education are intended to keep folks from continuing to take up that fight. It wasn't until January 6th that I truly realized, oh, none of this is promised, right? Like, we have a for real responsibility to protect the rights and the freedoms that we learn about in history books, that we've talked about in passing. This here is our moment to be in the history books 20, 30, 40 years from now. I think the National Association is really acutely aware of that. Locally, we are rebuilding that power. Thank you for sharing that anecdote about Mr. Gay, because this week is our Freedom Fund banquet. And so much stuff I do with this branch is I know we have 96 years worth of history, but that is such an incredible story that I would just engulf myself in. So yeah, that's where I think the association has been as far as diversity is concerned, making sure we have access to education. Thurgood Marshall was the lead attorney on the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Lead attorney in the case, I should say, not the decision. And it was at his behest that Charles Keller came to Las Vegas and created the Black legal community here, which then begot the NAACP. So all of it is woven together very tightly. So we got to know our history. It's got to be reflected accurately so that we don't make the same mistakes of yesteryear.
Thanks, Glenn. Okay, Ms. Amani, I'm not leaving you out, I promise.
No, you're dead.
So, we'll get a little deeper into the legislative bits now, y'all. I had to warm you up.
That was the softball.
I'm sorry. I'm an academic, y'all. Bear with me. Okay. So part of what's being, I guess, in the attack on DEI and some of this legislative material, there's various combinations of four main things. The dismantling of DEI offices altogether, not requiring diversity statements, not using, I guess, affirmative action in hiring, you could say, and doing things like getting rid of ethnic studies or just like an erasure, essentially, of the global majority is what I would say. And so thinking of your role as Senior Director of Student Diversity Programs, Amani, why is an office like that important at a place like UNLV?
Well, definitely. I know that myself, when I came to UNLV, you know, my eyes were just wide open. What can I get involved with? What I'm able to do as far as my experience here. So as far as like identity development, that's where our office steps in. We have many opportunities to engage with our students. I remember I was asked to, plan Black History Month here at UNLV. And I was like, of course I want to plan the Black History Month at UNLV. Go ahead and give it to me, thank you. And I had a student say, oh my gosh, why are all these non-Black people here? I thought this was a space for us. And I'm like, how do you expect people to learn about your culture if they're not invited to these spaces? So that was my opportunity to say, hey, everybody's invited to the cookout during Black History Month at UNLV. And that goes forth for all the Identity and Heritage Months that we have at UNLV. When it comes to Hispanic Heritage Month, if you never played Loteria, this is your time to play. If you never had a conversation about being a No Sabo kid, this is your opportunity to actually articulate your lived experiences here at UNLV and be a community with other students who have that same experience as you are. So again, that's for all of our months. And so we're specifically responsible for the identity-specific programming here. And my entire team is pretty much really strong in programming on campus and engaging students. So we lean into our community, whether that be a faculty group or RSO, to pretty much be culturally sensitive to the different topics we want to address in that month, and more so coalition build and hear from them, hey, what do you want to see in this month? And then we make that happen for our students and our faculty here.
Well, I know you're a big boss lady now, but you're also a double alumna of UNLV.
Yeah.
So how has the institutional culture changed since you were a student? And just wait. What initiatives did you participate in as a student that changed institutional culture?
So yeah, definitely. When it comes to my journey at UNLV, I started here in 2012. So I was able to witness the conversation about being daring, different, and diverse. So I saw the whole marketing rollout for that under President Lynn Jessup. So those were the conversations around what does an MSI look like and how does UNLV fit into that narrative. So you'll see the marketing all around. However, how did I contribute to it? At the time, I was the president of the Black Student Organization on campus, and this was I started my role right after I came back from my study abroad trip in Ghana. So I was, I'm ready to build this community. I'm ready to, let's get this happen. Let's get this popping, right? But at that time, we actually became an organization that actually stood in solidarity, not with only Mizzou at the time, but with our Native American Student Association at the time, because the conversations came back around the mascot, right? So, hey, how can you say you're diverse, but this person is our mascot? So we start learning the history of the mascot, learning that, UNLV, Nevada in general is a battle-born state, meaning that, we're born out of the Civil War, and the identity that UNR took and in how we wanted to be the opposition, right? So like our true, where rebels really came from, right? So how can you say you're diverse when you're saying, when your mascot used to be a Confederate soldier? So we'll have those conversations as student leaders with administration saying, this is the history of our mascot. How can you say that you're serving diverse students or you're here for diverse students when our representation is this person? Oh, he's no longer a Confederate soldier. We changed his, image. He's now a pioneer, right?
Did you say pioneer?
Pioneer. He's a pioneer. He's no longer a Confederate soldier. And then at that moment, as a Black student, I'm like, okay, he's no longer too offensive to me, but he's still offensive to student groups like our Native American Student Association. So then at that point, we're like, okay, let's go ahead and stand in solidarity with our Native American Student Association. And at that point, we created a whole coalition, MECHA, CSJ, like everyone was really involved with that. And we went ahead and had a protest on campus. Had a whole protest on campus. The media was there. And then after that, what I really appreciated at that time is that President Lynn Jessup had a town hall right immediately after. So we were able to have conversations around the identity of our mascot. So after that, we no longer have a mascot. We no longer have a mascot. So, that's a win for our current president. That was one of his first 90 days actionable items that he did on one of his deliverables. But I feel like that's a win for UNLV as well. I know we don't really talk about it as much as far as like our mascot and where we came from and the whole rebranding of what a rebel really is, right? We had to get rid of a lot of language that our institution was using that was aligned with the Confederacy. And that's problematic, especially when you're an MSI.
Thank you. So before we zoom out a little bit to look at national context, I feel like no one up on this panel got up here without being on fire as a student a little bit. So does anyone else have a story of how they got into DEI work as students that they'd like to share anyway?
I feel like I've been doing it so long, I don't even remember at this point.
Just a part of you.
But, easier on my campus. I went to Howard University, so I will say it's a training grounds. Went there for college and for law school. but a training grounds for, in my opinion, some of the best civil rights leaders that we've ever had in this country. And there's a rich legacy of activism that comes from that. Adjacent, though, to our universities are surrounding schools, including in Northern Virginia. And that became a significant talking point when things were moving forward, to the same point that UNLV had. My younger sister went here. I grew up in Vegas, and I remember it was always a topic of conversation. And even the NFL in the last few years we're on the topic of mascots and sort of like efforts to undermine inclusivity as a whole and the pushback. I don't understand why more businesses don't ask themselves up front, like maybe we should consider not having a mascot that's in human form, right? That might actually necessarily offend a group or multiple groups at the same time. And obviously in DC at the time, that was a big cause of action. The Washington Commanders had a previous name for their team, and the amount of resistance to changing the mascot was as if you would think that you went and burned down someone's grave, instead of actually just focusing on what the actual offensive nature of the mascot was. The odd part is in modern America right now, there is, and I'm assuming we're going to get there on the legislative piece, there's more of an effort from major corporate entities who were never viewed as the beacon of DEI work historically, but there's a significant effort on their end to push back on anti-DEI efforts at a consistent enough fashion to where now they're the target, oftentimes. I mean, we look at Disney, they're the target of legislative efforts to undermine DEI work. I did not think I would come here in 2024 as an ACLU director and a champion for big business, but we are where we are right now because folks have recognized in an inclusive nation where by 2042 we're going to have a majority minority public as a whole nationwide. These efforts become critical, and establishing inclusivity becomes paramount if you want economic viability as well.
Since I have you talking, we're going to zoom out to like a more national, I guess, lens on this. Part of what prompted me to suggest this episode for this series is hearing from my library colleagues, actually, in other parts of the country where these laws have passed, and either they passed at the top of this year or they passed at the last quarter of last year, and people don't know how to interpret them. Offices closed. People got reassigned if they were lucky, got fired if they were unlucky. No one knows what they can talk about, what they can't talk about. Is belongingness good enough to switch to instead of DEI? Is it not? So since you have been back here since 2021, but you've worked in other parts of the country, do you mind talking to us about sort of what's protected us legislatively here in comparison to some of the other states?
Yeah, and look, so, I'll share. So after law school, I practiced in New York for 3 years as a prosecutor there, right? Not a conventional path for an ACLU director. New York was always described as being incredibly diverse. I never viewed it diverse in terms of inclusivity. There's a lot of different groups represented, but none of the groups it's almost segregated by train stop. You go to one stop, you have one ethnic group, you go over another stop, it's a separate community over and over and over. And this was supposed to be a flagship model for what diversity is supposed to look like. Moved home to Vegas in 2015 and worked for a few different organizations during that time. And we end up looking at organizations, including orgs like the ACLU, as a model for what diversity is supposed to be. I'm the third person of color that's worked as a full-time employee of the ACLU of Nevada since 1966. I'm the first ED who's a person of color. So even our legacy institutions that are viewed as beacons for progressivism, for inclusivity, in fact, are not all that progressive, all that inclusive, and haven't been historically. The majority of opportunities weren't provided there. We have a majority minority staff now, which I'm very proud of, and that's because we went out and hired the best people, which goes to the efforts right now that the right throughout the United States is pushing. And I say the right specifically, we're a nonpartisan organization, but that's what the facts show. Mm-hmm. Every single piece of anti-DEI legislation that has been proffered throughout the United States right now has been pushed by the right. And specifically with respect to party platforms, The National Republican Party and many of the state parties have actually included anti-DEI efforts as a part of their platform. That is a fact. It's not an opinion that I'm offering. That is a fact. So we look at what happens state to state and community to community. Well, why is it that Nevada seems better off than some places? There's a couple reasons why. First, we have the practical elements. We have a robust business sector concentrated around gaming and tourism. And saying you're an anti-DEI state and you're not welcoming of all other communities doesn't exactly bode well for the bottom line, right? That's across the board. But second, it's because as a state, we lean heavily on the civil libertarian end. And again, there's a difference between political libertarianism, we don't want any government, versus civil libertarianism to a degree, which is we want limitations on infringements on civil liberties, which are, again, your individual rights. I think there's a couple elements that make things stronger here, and it's been demonstrated time and time again. I generally tell people when they ask me what I do, I just say I sue the government because people eat that up, right? I don't might not know what the ACLU, but everybody gets behind it, right? There's a sentiment there that's associated and directly in line. And what happens as a result of that is we're able to pass really, really good pieces of legislation in the state, at the state level. And that's not just through the state legislature, that's through things like ballot initiatives as well. An example of that, 2020 and 2022, voters get to decide. They passed the nation's most expansive equal rights amendment, period. That's here in Nevada. It's not in a northeastern state. It's not in California. It's right here in Nevada. The best ERA in the country that allows for language to be ingrained within our Constitution, which it has been, that protects not just what the Constitution protects, but goes a step beyond that. Includes protections for people based on their gender identity. That's not something that's included in a lot of other constitutions. It allows also for you to bring statewide claims under our state constitution to be able to challenge things, which makes things stronger here. There's two apparatuses by which you can lodge a legal challenge. You'll either go through state court system or federal court system. Well, for many of us who are advocates for diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, for justice, the federal route's not always our favorite route to take because it may head on up to the United States Supreme Court, which has been, by most accounts, by most scholars' accounts, increasingly political during the last decade in terms of the decision-making, doing away with precedent that's existed. The state of Nevada, we don't necessarily have that same issue. Our Supreme Court is elected. All of our district court judges are elected. Our Court of Appeals is also elected, so there's accountability there. But because of that, we also are able to push things through. And our Equal Rights Amendment here has been a great asset, I'd say a tool in the toolkit to protect against efforts to undermine these efforts overall. And I'm not saying those efforts aren't happening. Again, I won't speak on behalf of NSHE or on behalf of any university system, but there are active regents right now attempting publicly to undermine and undo DEI efforts. That's not any distinct from any other community, right? That's happening nationwide. So it doesn't get as much attention as it probably should. I think sometimes folks will see a story and say, hey, there goes those crazy regents again, right? But that's not sufficient. We need to, not all, we have some here, right? But no offense. But it is something that it's the same as the school board, Clark County School District, right? Something goes wrong and people have almost come to expect there to be a weird negative story about something. And it doesn't necessarily bode the best, but what does end up happening, what we want is for more people to pay attention to these items so we can make sure that there's inclusive efforts across the board, especially, in my opinion, for our Black administrators who are leading universities that are consistently subjected to these types of attacks.
That's a great segue over to Quinn. So, one of the sentiments in, I would say, the right-wing media, once again, not trying to be partisan, but he is correct. Most of the attacks are, all of the attacks are coming from that side. There's a taunt that's developed over time where DEI stands for didn't earn it. And didn't earn it is only ever used to refer to Black people in positions of power, just straight up. I found out about this taunt when the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapsed and Mayor Brandon Scott, I'm gonna mess up his name, rolled out of bed and people were criticizing what he looked like and what he was doing while he was trying to save people's lives. And so I don't go on a tangent. This has also happened for presidential hopeful Kamala Harris, there was a New York Post article very recently about her being a DEI candidate. So can you speak to why adopting a colorblind meritocratic perspective has proven to not yield equal outcomes in education? That could be K-12 education too, because those kids end up coming here.
Absolutely. The didn't earn it is so comical to me because I think about who's predominantly saying it. Mm-hmm. And then I think about who their foremothers and forefathers or who their ancestors were. And it's like, well, those were probably the folks who were on the slave ships. And y'all didn't earn it either because there was all this labor that these black folks did to build the economic engine of this country, right? So I think it's a little bit deflection is my initial thought. The colorblind sentiment that you outlined, I think, is the right's attempt to kind of pacify, not recognize, or just let it be numb about what the atrocities have been against people of color and indigenous people. Not to separate those groups, but it's very specific. You've massacred a whole group of people. This used to be land for indigenous tribes at one point, as it was all across the country, right? So this effort to I don't see color is just an abdication of responsibility and accepting what history has been. And what my grandmother, who's 93, would say is, when you know better, you do better, right? So you learn what the history of things have been with the hopes of not repeating those things. I'm old enough now to see that history doesn't really change. It just happens again in a different fashion, right? And when we tried to do this thing in the past, it didn't work out. It didn't work out at all. So then you had major judge decisions like Brown v. Board. And what people don't learn about is following Brown v. Board is in the implementation phase of that decision, the number of black educators that were fired, dismissed, reduced to nothing because of local municipalities' refusal to implement what the Supreme Court's decision was. And in many cases, when those black professionals who were teachers and educators were replaced, they were replaced by less qualified non-people of color. I found that out this year and was flabbergasted by that and have been down this rabbit hole ever since. I learned that the same week of the Brown v. Board anniversary. So I think the efforts to just be colorblind or these efforts to not acknowledge the most qualified candidates, erase, like you said before, the global majority, but specifically what the atrocities and terrible history has been that America has committed against people of color and indigenous folks.
So this panel is not about libraries, y'all, but I gotta insert some library stats based on that. So in addition to being the liaison for gender and ethnic studies here, I've worked in libraries for 12 years. I started in public librarianship and then transitioned over to academic librarianship. And there's a whole different panel we could have about book bans. I just talked about it on Friday, but this is a similar thing, right? Where people's lived experiences are being erased. Their First Amendment rights are being violated, really, with censorship. And so I'm going to segue this over to Ms. Clay T, who gets to talk to lots of different people across the Valley and hear all of their wonderful stories and gets to relate to us their efforts to move our city forward. And so just like books, why is it important for UNLV to be a repository for those stories, Clay T?
It's important because we are the place where people can store their stories, their memories, their manuscript collections, their photographs. All of it can be housed here. We then take care of it, house it in the right kind of conditions, and we make it available to researchers and students all over the world. And it is important for us to take care of all of that history, not just the mob, not just the Hoover Dam, but it's important for us to take care of everybody's history. We're all here together. We all have memories. We all made this history possible that we have here in Southern Nevada. Rich history, and everybody has contributed. So if we only collected a certain amount of history, everybody else would be just left behind or erased. Look at this audience. If we decided that we're not going to house the history of people of color, so we would have about half of this room that would not have history here at UNLV. So we can't leave out half of our history. We house all of it, and we have to have trust from the communities here. In order to house that history, they have to trust the university. So we have to be in the community, making sure that that happens, that we are true to our word, that we do make the history available once we collect it, and that it is processed in a very, very professional way. People come in and they see what we've done with their manuscript collections, and they are just in awe of the work that is done on a college campus. So that's how important it is that everybody is part of this history.
And I was just going to add that that is serious and in real time what Ms. Clayton is describing. Because this local branch is 96 years old, and there's no book that I can go to my office and pull out and see what happened at this meeting in 1984. We don't have that. And it's a little disappointing, honestly, as a young leader, because what I find myself doing is trying to figure out what the elders from some decades ago went through, endured, how they countered, who their partners were. We don't have that. So the extent of what I know about our branch is literally right here at this university.
Okay, so, and then we need to invite you into special collections because there are a couple of collections that we have that can help fill in some of the holes for you. Mm-hmm. Not all of them, because the materials were not maintained. Mm-hmm. Even those that were shared with the regional office in some cases, we don't know where that is either. And then there was a fire that destroyed lots of the NAACP records over the years. Wow. So, but we do have a couple of things that I'd like to show you. Mm-hmm. That is Sue Kim Chung right there. She knows where all of this is housed.
We're going to be friends.
Yes, we'll make her your best friend.
Good deal.
Mm-hmm. This is a shameless plug. Please come visit Lead Library and definitely Special Collections. There's a lot of really wonderful things up there that people don't necessarily know that we have. Okay, Imani. So you're in the trenches with the students. You are a student whisperer, as people have coined you. What are some things that you have noticed about students reacting to your really understanding them? I think obviously we are a university, right? And I'm in a little bit of a different teaching capacity than someone in a disciplinary position. So are you. You're in a different kind of position, but a lot of times we're not grading students. They just get to be themselves around us. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important for many reasons, including them getting to the end of their matriculation, right? But it also requires some intention and thought about what's going to bring them in and maintaining trust, honestly, like Clay T mentioned. Mm-hmm. So what's the secret sauce for getting the students to trust you?
Well, definitely, the first thing I like to tell people that I give students permission, right? So, for instance, I do sit on a lot of RSO boards to be their advisor, their faculty advisor, and pretty much they trust me based on what I have done on the campus, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how the word got out, hey, Monty used to do this. It just, they trust me because of my tie to the university. And with that being said, I have conversations with my e-boards. Like I will have a bi-weekly one-on-one with my president. Just to tap in, see how they're doing, see, what their ideas are. And then when I say I give students permission, like they would tell me their idea and I'll help them make it happen. And I definitely had that opportunity when I was a BSO president at the time. I was very fortunate enough to have a librarian be my faculty advisor at the time. Shout out to Ms. Latika Grays, and definitely cultivated my skills on how to facilitate a meeting, how to plan a program. And that's what I pretty much step in when it comes to my students. I let them know, like, hey, I'm here to support your vision. I'll let you know how you're gonna, how to go about making things happen, just because, you need to book a space. You need to do advertisement like 2 weeks in advance. But I'm also here to cultivate your skills. You know, when it comes to my student involvement, I actually applied to be a director at the Boys and Girls Club and got the job immediately, just based on my student involvement activities. I didn't even put any of my work experience on the resume. They were like, oh, you know how to plan a program? We need you. And I feel like when it comes to my students, I want them to leave this place getting everything that they need from this place, right? So I asked them, what do you major in? Oh, I major in psychology. What are you trying to do with that? You know, some students know, some students don't. And I know for myself, my bachelor's degree is in kinesiology. So, you know, it's a whole story, but, you know, the journey might take you elsewhere. And understanding, hey, yeah, the journey might take you elsewhere, but what you're responsible as a student leader right now, those skills are transferable. You know, no matter what the job is, they're going to need to know if you're a great communicator. What have you planned? What have you successfully planned from start to completion? So, yeah, so when it comes to my students, I definitely give them permission, and then I let them fail. You know, some people don't want to see students fail, but I let them fail. And then with that being said, hey, that's what a debrief is about. So pretty much everything when it comes to programs, like how do you create the ambiance when you walk in? They have to be very intentional. Like they give me their idea, okay, how do we make it happen? Are we playing music when they walk in? Who's doing check-in? You know, you need to start delegating tasks. I don't want you're the president. You shouldn't be doing everything. What are you going to have your e-board do? So all of that, and when they see the outcomes, I feel like that just affirms our relationship, if that makes sense.
Totally does, yeah. And this is the kind of passion and care that's lost when DEI offices are dismantled and it doesn't matter and we don't care about ethnic studies or people's identities.
Can I mention one thing? So I had the opportunity to go to a conference my last year in college, and the conference was AFLV Central. So it's a fraternity and sorority conference in Indiana. And at that moment, I was like, wow, instead of this kinesiology thing, because I'm not really feeling it, I could work at a university and cultivate leaders for a living. This is fun, right? So my path took me into working in fraternity and sorority life, where I was advisors for the National Panelists Council, which is the historically Black fraternities and sororities, but also our Multicultural Greek Council as well, which is where we have Latina fraternities and sororities, Asian interest, even an Arab interest sorority. So with that being said, I was able to tap into different cultures, learn about different, rush processes and everything like that. But where I'm going with this, I never saw myself working in diversity. I just knew I had a voice and I advocate for my students and I program really well. So when I was asked to be in this position, I just got into this position knowing that there's anti-DEI legislation going on. That's not really, how do I say it? It's, for some people may have thought that was not smart. You don't know what's happening in November. You don't know if your position's gonna be here. I have employees who actually relocated because of anti-DEI legislation at their higher ed institution. But with that being said, the passion really just comes from me listening to my students and telling my administrators what's happening. And I really encourage you all to do the same. I feel like when it comes to working at a university, the student narrative gets lost. You know what I mean? We're here to serve the students, but sometimes we get into these positions and I'm just clocking in, clocking out, right? So it's like, how are you impacting the students while you're here? So that's my whole thing when it comes to that.
Well, I appreciate a good social, cultural capital infuser. I try to do the same in the time I spend with students. So we are about at 3:30, I think, so it is time for Q&A if anybody has something.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead. Oh, hang on just a second. There's a mic. Thanks for the people online.
As the mic's coming around, I can't help but marvel at the fact that being a librarian is like far more dangerous than almost any other job in America right now.
Yes. Uh-huh.
It is.
Yes.
Thank you. Testing. One of one, the only one. Okay. True, library, Fahrenheit 451, is that? Yeah,
Yeah,
those times. Handmaid's Tale, of course it is. My question has a lot to do with psychology because I'm in the Master's of Public Health program with a special emphasis on social and behavioral health. And I've noticed that a lot of DEI antagonists fundamentally fear replacement. There seems to be a under-addressed psychological component. The opposition often talks about often uses what is basically abuse tactics from consistent negative news, deflection, and lack of accountability. So I guess my question is, it's less of a question, more of a statement. Integration of health psychology into DEI efforts, is that something that we could explore? Is that something that's explored here? And if so, am I woefully undereducated? And if so, how do I fix that?
Does anyone have an answer to that? I will take a stab at it.
I was just having this conversation before walking in to this space, because one of my questions was like, where do you see the climate, like with the climate, where do you see UNLV? I'm gonna be completely honest. I don't believe it exists here, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's opportunity for it to be interwoven. And with it comes to UNLV, I was actually nervous when you asked me to sit on this panel because I was like, man, I work here. I work here. So we recently just had MSI week, right? Because I just want to say my piece. We recently just had MSI week, and going to the programs, yes, they're great. But I asked myself, what is the purpose? You know, students should know UNLV is an MSI before they get here, right? So then we have conversations like these different supports. Do they exist? No, they don't. We have to ask ourselves, how are we supporting UNLV's Latinx student population, let alone our faculty and staff population? You know, outside of programs, because I'm in programming, outside of programming, how are we supporting this group of students? What academic supports are they given that's very intentional to this group of students? Same thing when it comes to our anti-DEI students, our Black students. And I actually had to face this last week at the Southern Nevada Diversity Summit. I went to a session and they say, hey, what does your university do to support Black students, right? I'm like, yeah, we have tutoring. Yeah, we have all these great supports, advisors and stuff like that. But is it really intentional to a Black student's success at UNLV? Like, how are we benchmarking our students' success here at UNLV? And then when it comes to not having these supports, why are we not honest about not having these supports and creating these supports here at UNLV? So my charge to UNLV, mind you, I love UNLV, I'm a rebel. My charge to UNLV is to be a MSRI unapologetically, you know? So I feel like a lot of these conversations at UNLV, I personally do not know. I'm happy you didn't answer that question. I personally don't know what's happening with UNLV when it comes to DEI, because there's one thing called equity talk, and there's another thing when it comes to equity walk. Right? And I feel like walking is initiatives. Like, it's great hearing that Nevada State University has a SACOFA program where they recruit Black students to come stay at their campus for the summer, and they teach Black students how to be a student at at Nevada State University. And then also hearing that CSN has that as well, right? But I'm like, okay, now with it coming down to us being actually a Hispanic serving institution and an anti-DEI serving institution, where do we show up? I know that there's certain grants here and there that's for all, but why are we so afraid to have something specific for a group? And I feel like we hit the mark when it comes to diversity. In my mind, diversity is the number, right? We have the numbers. Like, the numbers say that we're diverse. We hit the mark when it comes to inclusion. We're doing really well with inclusion. But when it comes to equity, and I feel like that's the issue when it comes to just this topic in general, the equity part is where people like get their feathers ruffled. Why does this certain group get this and this certain group doesn't get that? And it's like, well, here's the history. We're trying to have an equal playing field for everyone. So my thing is, I want us to be more unapologetically an MSRI, but also that's why we need Students for You to step up. We need more mental health supports here within UNLV, because I can only tell you CAPS. And then I'm telling my students CAPS, and they're on a wait list. You know what I mean? And I'm like, okay, well, you can go over here to the CFT program and go to their clinic, their student clinic, and they're like, that's a wait list too. So yeah, definitely speak up, and these things can come to fruition. Can
I mention one thing on that? So actually, I don't see that frequently come up anywhere in the country with respect to psychology, and probably more appropriate for psychiatry-related assessments and studies. But I think that it has been thoroughly explored in the political sort of academic lane, right? So political science and comparative politics has sort of brought this up. But there's certainly a desire, because the academic portion behind what disinformation has led to, including things like people believing in the validity of the Great Replacement theory, which doesn't exist, right? But they continue to promulgate that nationwide as a talking point, much the same way they'll do with other disinformation campaigns, whether that's about vaccines somehow leading to something. We've seen it last week about something with respect to lithium batteries and 5Gs in the hurricane. It's hard to keep track of all of it, right? But the impact on the public, primarily post-COVID and during the shutdown period, where we're seeing more belief in disinformation across the country than we ever have before. Folks are promulgating themselves as being academic scientists or politically nuanced, when in reality they created a meme, threw it on Facebook, and somebody's grandma fell for the misinformation, right? Not exactly the best of sciences, and it's actually dangerous overall for what the future looks like, not only from a political perspective, but from a public health perspective as well. So I would definitely continue encouraging that approach wherever you might find support for it, because 5 to 10 years from now, we're probably going to have to look back on what's happened right now and start assessing and questioning sort of how disinformation managed to permeate every level. I'll give one pointed example, and people are going to have different thoughts about it, but it's important that you hear this point. There is a ballot question about voter ID coming, and a lot of people will say, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with voter ID? Or they'll pivot into why it's harmful for people to present that ID at a public body when they're voting. And they'll say it's rooted in difficulties with respect to access to ID. It's targeting vulnerable groups. All of that's true. What's also true is nobody has the name of a single voter in Nevada who's committed voter impersonation. That's right. So you're looking for it's effectively rooted entirely in misinformation and disinformation, or somebody would have a name. But nobody has a name, because these are tools used to encourage political turnout. It's the process of othering politically that's existed for years. So when we look at something like that, we have to ask the initial question: what's your premise for this? And if your premise is built on a lie, which it is, the Brennan Center is actually a national voting rights group, nonpartisan, put out an academic report, and it says the odds of voter impersonation occurring are statistically less likely than being struck by lightning. And yet, if you were to get on Facebook or Twitter or whatever it's called now, you'd look at any post out there, and you would be instantly subject to a notion that every other person is engaged in voter impersonation, and there's 20 million Guatemalans getting ready to storm Nevada to cast their ballot and rig the election. It's fake, right? But that study needs to be conducted, because the notion of being able to absorb that misinformation and believe it to be true seems to be varying person to person. We all have family members probably that have fallen subject to disinformation as well. Doesn't seem like there's a rhyme or a reason. So I'd personally be interested in reading your research once it's complete.
And if I could add, all over the country this is happening. Like, Nevada's not the only place that has this kind of voter ID question. And the folks who are running these questions, they know that what Atar says is true. Yet they put millions of dollars behind these campaigns to run what I call ballot candy, right? Do you have places in Arizona, Nebraska that have citizen-only voting ballot measures? Now, it's already the federal law that you have to be a citizen in order to vote. So to run a ballot measure to pass a law that's already law and put money behind that just goes to show you how far the right is invested monetarily in taking away your rights and driving out the people who are most likely to vote for the most extreme of the extreme ballot measures, candidates, et cetera, et cetera. So when folks say their vote doesn't matter, it absolutely does. They're spending millions of dollars on it trying to take your rights away.
Thanks. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you all for being here. Really appreciate the discussion here. And Amani, thank you for doing your work on the mascot a while ago. That's my question. I've worked here 30 years. I think I still have some scars on my head from hitting my head against the wall on that very topic. I've been somebody that, just knowing UNLV's history of breaking away from the North, red and gray colors. We had the little Robert Lee soldier, as our mascot. We had the Confederate flag on our football helmet, for God's sake. So we definitely have that history. And I'm wondering, I'm glad that we got rid of the visual mascot, but do you think UNLV still sends a message with keeping the name Rebels, and have we kind of missed that opportunity as far as sending a more positive message of finding a different representative for UNLV? That's for all of you. I don't want to put Amani on the spot. Let's go to the employees. I'm close enough to retirement. I'm not worried, but she's not.
Do we still have the flag on campus?
I'm sorry.
Do we still have the flag?
I believe it's still. Isn't it still
On the
floor?
Was it the Barrack Museum? Yeah, the Barrack Museum.
Okay, so that's from years ago. That's from, okay, so that's from years and years ago. I think the idea was to erase all of that connection. And it started because UNR was in charge of the education here. Before you could get a degree at UNLV at one point, you had to take some classes at UNR. So it was that break and that battle that started this thing. And I don't know how Beauregard got into it, but he was the one that was chosen. But I think they tried to erase all semblance of that connected with the South, with the Civil War, and supposedly now we're only supposed to have the word rebels. That's all. That's what it's supposed to be.
It's supposed being the key word.
Yes.
We missed that opportunity to just get rid of that image and start with a fresher identity.
So if all of those symbols have been erased, I think I'm okay with it, but all of the symbols have to be erased. That fat guy, all of that. All of that the mustache, all of that has to go. I can live with the word rebel, but I cannot live with any other symbols that identify me with the Civil War and with the South. And I think that was what was supposed to have happened. And I have not paid enough attention. I don't know if we still have those flags on the helmets or not. So I'm guilty.
Just, we don't. I'm just thinking the history and just ingrained in people's minds. I'm still one of those that's been here long enough, but I still hear the term rebel. I'll be honest, it's hard for me sometimes to still disassociate. And I love the school. I've been here 30 years, but...
Yeah, I still have shirts with mustache. I had to get rid of all that stuff. I remember even with the latest logo, when he no longer had a color, I wore that shirt to campus, and it was like, that's contraband. They was like, why are you wearing that shirt? I was like, okay, well, where was this conversation had? Because it wasn't at no orientation. So, and that's the news. I'm like, so if you miss one day, you missed the announcement. But Clay T says, I don't have an issue with being a rebel. I feel like, however, I know there's conversations that students want to create a mascot. I feel like it's really important to have a student focus group or whatever, be in those conversations to defining what this new era of a rebel is and what that mascot should be. Because even with the shirt that I'm talking about, this is what I heard. We can fact check, but they paid a marketing consultant to do that.
They did.
You know what I mean? And that's what I'm talking about. Like, you take away student voice. Like, you could have did all that in house. You know what I mean? Could have had a graphic design competition with the graphic design major. So I said, when you eliminate students from the situation, they still wouldn't. Like, you want endearment to the mascot. That's the purpose. So, I love it being rebel because I feel like we can redefine what that is. But if we take it a little step further and, have those conversations of what this is moving forward to include students in that.
So it sounds like we have some homework to do.
Yeah.
I also hate to cut y'all off, but we have a few more questions. I'm sorry.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciated this. My name is Miss Bev. I'm a master's student. I got my bachelor's here 2 years ago. I'm also the founder and the president of the Alliance of Non-Traditional Students, the older students. So I come to every MSI DEIA. I learned to add an A. I was told access, right? DEIA. Event that I can because I need to learn these conversations, these words, to apply them to what I'm here to represent, the last minoritized group in higher education, which is the non-traditional student, the student that's over 24, formerly incarcerated, parents, neurodiverse. That's the people that I represent. So I understand that we're talking about federally recognized minorities, Latinx, Anapisi. I was at the MSI Summit. I learned a lot about Anapisi, but the speaker, Dr. Robert Teranashi, I went up to him later and said, I have a question for you. You disaggregated the data for Asians, right? Because it was just one big group, and Asians is not one big group, right? And you disaggregated the data, and you found that some groups within that disaggregation did not graduate as well or didn't have the higher persistent rate. I have a question for you. Did you look at age as a component? Did the younger ones do better than the older ones? And he just looked at me. He says, holy crap, call me. So my question is to the group, because I know what we're talking about, and sorry if I'm going a little over the other side, but that's who I am. If you see me, I'm going to go there. So what can the students' groups or the students that identify, because obviously I'm a woman and obviously I'm of color, but I'm here as a non-traditional student. So how do we get our conversation into the college at the DEI level, at the what do we need to change when we're not a federally recognized, so there's nothing, the college is very receptive, don't get me wrong. In fact, our group, Dr. Whitfield and Dr. Rogers will be meeting with my group this month. So they're hearing us, they're listening, mainly because I'm from New York and I'm loud. But what do we do within higher education? Because when we talk about diversity and we give an explanation of diversity, I don't hear age. So anybody?
Yeah, I could probably jump in with that. It's not just that there's not a federal qualifier and designation there. There's not a state one either. So the protections are in place to preclude against discrimination, right? So if we look at our ERA, for instance, in Nevada, there's an age-based component to it. The reason why some of these get, and sorry if I sound wonky and technical, but I'll be wonky and technical for a moment. The reason why it matters where it's placed in the Constitution versus under statute is because there's a different level of scrutiny that's applied in a discrimination analysis that comes up. If it is a characteristic that's reached the top level or a constitutionally recognized group there, any restriction on that group must satisfy strict scrutiny. That's the highest level, which means that a restriction is going to need to be narrowly tailored to further a compelling government interest. Historically speaking, age-based criteria was viewed the same way as gender-based criteria. And gender-based criteria and age-based criteria both fell into a middle category of scrutiny, which is different from race and religion. Race and religion, national origin have always or at least in modern times, fallen under that top level of scrutiny. That middle level, though, makes it easier for a restriction to occur, because all you have to do is have a restriction or a policy significantly related to an important government interest. So it doesn't have to be narrow and related to a compelling government interest to do it. The reason why I mention that specifically is the majority of contexts in which we discuss these items, primarily, and you mentioned DEIA, but there's like 18 different ways of doing it, right? We at the ACLU have equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, EDIB.
And the JEDI.
My favorite one is JEDI, which starts with justice, right? And it sounds cool too, as well. Like when you say, rolls off the tongue a little easier. But there's a lot of different approaches to it. What I'd probably encourage is if you're seeking specific status-based assessments within specific policies or support, if it's going to go through NCHI, find the specific body that you're looking at and attempt to lobby that group to create that. Normally, most of these changes happen at a hyper-local level before they advance up to a state level and beyond that. The one challenge that ends up existing in Nevada, probably versus most places, is that the elements we have in place with respect to what DEI efforts look like, the specific reason why they exist is to draw a direct contrast to specific elements of discrimination that often end up occurring, right? Majority of this is to advance society, but also to mitigate against those harmful attempts that occur. In our state, a lot of times we end up taking that for granted. And the reason why we take it for granted specifically is because our laws have been put out there and they're strong. The anti-discrimination laws are strong here. The issue becomes when we look at the other elements, I think Imani spoke to specifically to the equity portions, right? That's not something that law always supports. And in fact, not only is anti-DEI legislation being promulgated and pushed, for those that have heard of Project 2025,
yes.
Which is the Heritage Foundation's blueprint for what America should look like. The specific analysis that they undertake there is to attack a specific problem called a disparate impact analysis. And a disparate impact analysis allowed for specific concentrations for procurement, for hiring, for things like that. And in order to mitigate against it, you'd have to show discriminatory intent and disparate impact. They've effectively pushed back against that second prong and are saying they're going to attempt to gut that from all analysis moving forward. So if there is a disparate impact, it won't play out. But happy to chat further about that. I just wanted to make sure I shared a couple of those components too.
And back in the 1990s, when I was on campus earning a master's degree, there were a whole group of us at that time over the regular age of students. And we were able to talk with Dr. Kara Harder, and she included us in so many things that she did. Now, I would have to take the time to think about all that happened at that time, but it was starting to happen. We even had a place on campus where we could come together. It was like a study area just for us. So there were all kinds of things being done that started at that time, and I don't know what has happened. Evidently, it has fallen by the wayside someplace along the way, but those conversations did start early on.
And can I add one more thing? I'm so sorry. I encourage you to start doing research in this area. Just to get, it's a gap. And I feel like you have a passion for it. I'm sorry. I feel like you have a passion for it. So with that passion, I would encourage you to start research.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's all.
I appreciate that, but I will say that UNLV Dr. Fain
yes.
in 2021 did hire me after I graduated. And UNLV is sitting on a 50-page research project by me on programs and changes based on me listening to the voices of the non-traditional student. But I appreciate all of you. Thank you.
Yes, that's great.
Thank you for that. Sorry, I wish we could keep chatting. I had some things to add too, but I'm getting the time to cut the mic. So in closing, thanks everybody for participating. And of course, I've got to thank our sponsors, UNLV Libraries and the Greenspan College of Urban Affairs. I also want to thank UNLV TV for streaming these important conversations. And if you would like more information on this topic, please go to library.unlv.edu/we-need-to-talk. If you've ever heard Clay T mention the research guides, that's usually where I am. So I'm behind the scenes. I put a lot of work into them, and I hope they help you go deeper on the subject. Thank you for joining our conversation today, and we look forward to joining you for our next conversation in the spring.
Wonderful.
I didn't even think about that part. You know, you go to Reno